Hey, folks, I am blonde in the belly of the beast, and I have here with me today actual social justice warrior. Welcome.
Oh no, you did the thing.
Oh, I'm sorry, actual justice warrior. You
Yes.
know, I even put in my notes, like not to say that, and then I still did it. The reason I made this mistake is because I just became familiarized with your content. I'm obsessed with true crime, like many broads, and I've gone down this Julius Jones rabbit hole, which led me to your channel and uncovered your incredible catalog. So I've just discovered you in the last week, so that is why I made that mistake. I'm very sorry.
It's okay.
Um, but welcome. Thanks for joining me today. We should just get right into it. We have a lot to talk about. So, for those in my audience that are unfamiliar, could you give some details of the Julius Jones murder of Pal Hall, and just catch my audience up on the details of the case?
All right. So on July 28th, 1999, Julius Jones, who is a known carjacker, or he has a repeated history of carjacking, with his accomplice, Chris Westside Jordan, worst nickname in the history of the game, decided that they wanted to steal a GNC Suburban. So Paul Howe drives this vehicle, and at the time he was living at his parents' house because he was going through a divorce, and he was taking his children, his two young girls, aged 9 and 7, shopping with his sister. They stop off at an ice cream shop to get ice cream for the kids on the way back home. This is where they're spotted by Jones and Jordan. They drive back to the house. Jones approaches them as they're getting out of the car in, again, his parents' driveway, and without saying a single word, shoots Paul Howell dead directly in the head, then shoots at the family as they flee to get inside the house, gets in the car, crushes Paul Howell's legs as he's leaving the driveway, and takes off with the car. And just for a point of clarification, in 1999, the value that you could get on the street for a GNC Suburban was about $4,000. So he murdered him instantly in front of his kids for $4,000.
And he didn't even say anything. He just walked right up to him and blew his brains out.
Yeah, no words. He just shot him directly in the head.
Oh
And
my gosh.
he gets tried for this. He's put on a capital case and he was convicted because the evidence against him, which we'll get into, is overwhelming. And all of a sudden, 2016, 2017, ABC 2020 and the Innocence Project produced a documentary called The Last Defense, which is narrated by Viola Davis, which makes the case for him being innocent based on misinterpretations of evidence and a legitimate claim that certain evidence should have been tested for DNA or can now be tested for DNA. So
Right.
like
Right.
that has like led to a giant social media campaign. Thus, the Justice for Julius Jones campaign was born.
Right. And for those of you that have heard about this, you may have heard about it because I just found out that Kim Kardashian is trying to
Yeah.
get the sentence vacated. When you're standing up to this kind of celebrity and media pressure, there must be incredible pressure on the governor of Oklahoma. The Innocence Project picked this up, and change.org petition. I think it has 7 million
Yeah.
signatures. So I believe he's going to be executed on the 18th.
He is scheduled for execution on the 18th. He's gone through a clemency hearing. He's gone through a different type of hearing. I forgot the name of it. And he actually recently testified for the first time ever, which I would love to get into because
Okay.
there's a reason he didn't testify at trial.
Right, right. His attorneys were like, no.
No.
So I think the best way to approach this is to talk about the points that the Innocence Project brought up and what Kim Kardashian is saying. And I think the first thing, the suspect description, the sister of Paul Howell came out and she was describing how he had a skull cap on. And
Yeah.
she said something about the distance between an inch and a half distance between the skull cap and the ear. And this was, I believe, deliberately misconstrued as saying that he had an inch and a half of hair. Julius Jones was shaved almost clean. And she
Yeah.
has said to this day that she's like, that's not what I was saying. If you read the transcript, I think it's pretty obvious that that's not what she was saying. So if you want to talk a little bit about this is the first point that people on the left are bringing
Yeah.
to the Julius Jones case, that the suspect was misidentified.
So, like, one of the things that I found interesting, because Megan Toby's description is really detailed, and you would think if you saw your brother shot right in front of you, you wouldn't be able to glean this much information. But it turns out she worked as a costume designer, so paying attention to the details of clothing was literally her job. So Jones could not have picked a worse witness to leave alive in this scenario. So what
Right.
she described was a red bandana over the shooter's face, a stocking cap, and a white shirt with black trim. which is very specific. All of these items were found in Julius Jones's bedroom. The white shirt with black trim and the red bandana was found with the murder weapon wrapped inside it in a hiding place in Julius Jones's closet. Now, the last offense basically excerpts one portion of her description, which, like you said, describes like an inch or an inch and a half, or sometimes, if you're watching the mainstream media, long hair, which was never said once, sticking out from the stocking cap. But what you can clearly hear her saying is hair around where the ear connects to the head, which
Right.
is like the sideburn
Sideburn.
area
Yeah.
to the top of the skull cap. And she's never changed her story. They asked her in trial, which is one of the things that the last defense lies about. They say that the defense never questioned this description. They exploited this at trial. That she said that it she said that there was no braids. She couldn't see braids. She couldn't see cornrows. And the reason this is important is because Chris Westside Jordan, the guy that they're portraying as the shooter, like the actual shooter, the guy that they're actually trying to frame for the murder, had cornrows at the time. But Megan Toby specifically denies this. She denies this to this day. She's never changed her story, despite what the Innocence Project said. And the description matches Julius Jones because he had
Right.
a fade.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. This Christopher Jordan frames Julius Jones thing, I think, is particularly preposterous because if everybody is so racist, then why would they try to pin it on the other black guy? It makes no sense to me. So I think that the next point that needs to be discussed is this DNA evidence. Now, the red bandana should have been tested. I know that a lot of strides have been made in DNA testing since the 90s. And they did test it eventually. Was it the defense that pushed for the red bandana to be
Yes.
tested heal?
Yeah, so
Okay.
they push for it. It's actually the last defense takes place in 3 different parts. It's basically the entire premise of part 3 that we need to get this DNA tested. And at the end of the documentary, they're like, the DNA testing has been approved. We will see. Like basically, this will prove Jones innocent.
Ugh.
And and the reason they didn't test the bandana in 1999 is because the type of DNA testing that they did was not available in 1999. So, like, they tested it. I agree with them testing it. It's a death penalty case. We have to be sure. But what they found when they tested it is that Chris Jordan's DNA was not on the bandana,
Right.
and Julius Jones's DNA was on the bandana. And the odds of another person, another black person, contributing to that DNA sample were 1 in 110 million African Americans. 35
Yikes.
African Americans in 1999. 35 million African Americans in 1999. And I've heard them say that it's actually 1 in 110 million African American males. So
Oh,
that would
okay.
be 17 and a
Right.
half million at the time. You would need 6 times the population to statistically to find a match. And they would have to have access to Julius Jones's bedroom.
Right, which had all of the suspect
Yeah.
identification. It was all in his bedroom. So, if Christopher Jordan framed Julius Jones by wrapping a bandana covered in his DNA around the murder weapon, it's like case closed. Oh my god.
Yeah.
Wouldn't his touch DNA have been found on it?
Yeah, that's the thing is like we didn't know touch DNA. Some scientists will say they theorized that it existed in 1999, but it was not generally available in the public, let alone by some 19-year-old gangbanger with obviously, not he's not very bright to be able to frame Julius Jones with this DNA and remove his own. So there's just no
Right.
in one day, by the way,
Mhm.
because they found the bandana like 2 days after and they said Jones spent the night with I'm sorry, Jordan spent the night with Jones like that night or something like that. So he would have had to have concocted this plan, plant some DNA that would never be tested for 20 years in order to frame Julius Jones. It's just not possible.
Right. So what do defenders of Julius Jones say about the outcome of this DNA testing, which is clearly definitive and shows that he's the murderer? How can they square this circle?
Well, they've run with a number of excuses. I think it's funny because Julius Jones in his finally when he testified said he never wore bandanas, which hurts them even more because it's not like he said that was mine, but Chris Jordan wrapped it in there in order to frame me like something in my room. He said he never wore bandanas, which is ridiculous. And what they do is they point to some degraded DNA that's on the bandana and they'll
Mhm.
say there was 3 other people that touched that bandana, like minor contributors. But in reality, this is like degraded to the point where we just know it's human DNA and we don't know necessarily that this is not Jones's DNA or anybody's DNA. It's like a basic thing. Or, when he bought the bandana from the store, the person who bagged it for him's DNA. Like
Right.
it's a tiny minor sample that nobody, literally nobody on earth could be excluded from. So it's meaningless.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I don't know how they could possibly talk their way out of this, but the documentary ended saying that they needed to
Yeah.
test the DNA.
Well, the way that they mostly try to get around it, that's their answer when they're directly questioned on the DNA. The way that they get around it is just never mention the bandana, which I
Right.
always find hilarious. And I play that clip in my video where they have 4 different experts talk about how they need to get this DNA tested. They get it tested at one of the most reputable labs in the nation, and then they never bring it up. They never
Right.
talk about it. They just removed it from the website. I'm sure if you went and archived it back from 2017, you would see
Right.
this DNA there, but they just, what DNA?
Yeah. Yeah. Let's talk about the alibi. If I have to hear about this fucking cookie like one more time, my head is going to explode. But the alibi was that he was eating spaghetti and playing Monopoly, so wholesome, and
Yeah.
eating a giant cookie with his family. And I've heard people that defend Julius Jones say, well, the family lived 20 minutes away. 20 minutes.
Yeah.
They don't live 9 hours away. They live 20 minutes away. So I feel like that's not a defense. His family was clearly lying for him. Julius had 2 different public defenders that he told these public defenders that he was not at home
Yeah.
during the crime. And the public defenders did not want to bring the family up as witnesses because they knew that they would perjure themselves. And so they didn't. And then he also told his girlfriend, and his girlfriend, I believe, testified
Yes.
saying that he was not at home during the crime. And then he sent her a threatening
Yeah.
letter. A threatening letter. If you want to talk a little bit about what the documentary said about the alibi, what defenders of
Yeah.
Julius Jones are saying about the alibi.
So the alibi issue, I mean, he's changed his story on where he was multiple different times in public record. But the alibi issue is ridiculous. The idea, first of all, it makes him sound like he's 10 years old. He's
Right.
like, I was eating a big plate of spaghetti. My sister took my birthday cookie. I was crying to my mom about this birthday cookie. And Jones told his attorneys that not only was he not home the night of the murder, but his family was mistaken on the date that this birthday celebration occurred, which is crucial because upon appeal, not only did his lawyers testify, but they tried to produce an independent witness who is this woman with, like, in terms of a witness, would have been amazing for Jones. She was like a former teacher of the year, impeccable member of society, a woman called Brenda Cujo. So she came to the court and she said that she went to Kinko's before she dropped her kid off at and like attended the Jones birthday celebration. And she actually produced a receipt from Kinko's, which was the day before the murder.
Mhm.
So we know for sure that this alibi is not valid. We have confirmation that these events, as described, are the day before. So, like, it's just a garbage alibi. And the attorney, if you listen to the podcast where he actually talks about it, Jones's defense attorney, he said, I didn't put that on the stand because I knew it was false and I didn't want them to go after. I needed Jones's family to appear sympathetic, and the fact that they're lying to get their murderous son out of prison
Right.
is not sympathetic.
And this claim only emerged during appeal anyway, right?
Yeah. Well, it emerged during trial on the defense side because the
Right.
family was trying to get him off. And
Mhm.
by the way, the family's version is super inconsistent. I've been watching interviews and all these different things. And in the last defense, the documentary, the sister says, like, they're chasing him around the house and they're like, we didn't know it at the time, but the man in Edmond had been murdered, which is interesting because they say they found out in that version of events about the murder on the news the next day.
Mhm.
But the father says that him and Julius watched it on the news that night.
That night.
Yes.
Right.
And the sister says in another interview on the Real Talk, and you could just compare and contrast this, that they watched it that night, like as it was happening, which is, I mean, I'm sure there was reporting quickly after, but not that quickly.
Right, right. And it wasn't just the witnesses in the car with Paul Howell that identified Julius Jones. There were 2 additional witnesses, right, that put him
Yeah.
in the Suburban the day of the murder, right after
Yeah.
the murder.
So there's actually 5 or 6 witnesses, but what the Jones defense team is trying to do is say, oh, this person had a criminal record, therefore, and they had to gain, like, Chris Jordan, obviously, if he was the shooter, if we believe their theory, would have a lot to gain by going to the prosecutor and saying, no, Jones was the shooter. So we understand that. But there was an independent witness at the ice cream shop that spotted Jones and Jordan, and he described one of the black like teenagers, Jones was 19 at the time, as somebody wearing the skull cap, bandana right here, short closely cropped hair, black white shirt with black trim. And then he described the other one wearing something different but with cornrows. That's your Chris Jordan. So we already have Jones, like there's, and this was 15 minutes before the murder. They followed the Howe family from the ice cream shop to the home.
Right.
So the idea that they swapped clothes and swapped positions in the car is absurd. Then there's witnesses after the murder. So we have, I think it's Kermit Lottie and his girlfriend. And if you want to say they're not credible, that's whatever. But the neighbor also saw Jones like driving the Suburban after the fact. And Jones
Right.
admits to driving the Suburban because he thought he was caught on surveillance video driving it. But in reality, he was caught on surveillance video ditching the car.
Right. Which just disproves his alibi. I believe that they said that he was there the whole night, right? The family?
Yeah, well, yeah, they said he was there to a certain point, and then later on, when they had the surveillance video, they're like, okay, but he left later because they needed him to sell the car or something like that. Also important, one of the people said that Jones like admitted because they knew on the news that this Suburban had a body on it. That's why nobody wanted to buy it. And they asked Jones what happened, and he said he didn't really know. He walked up to the car, and a little girl waved at him in the back seat of the car, and then there's different versions of it where the gun just went off, or he thought Hal was coming out with the gun or whatever, and that's why he fired instantly. Well, the daughter told the police at that time that she waved at the man that walked up
Right.
to the car.
Yeah.
So you have two different sources of the investigation giving you this information that literally only the shooter and this girl would know,
Right.
and it's tied to Jones.
Yeah, exactly. I think that a lot of the sympathy surrounding this has just been the way that Julius Jones has been portrayed as an individual and as a victim. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I want to dispel some of those myths because he has outright threatened his girlfriend
Yes.
at the time, who's totally detonated his alibi.
Yes.
Let's talk about that, and then let's talk about, although there were no specific threats, sending messages to the sister of Paul Howell at her home, which just shows like, I know where you live. Change your testimony. If you could talk a little bit about how he's been threatening to the family of Paul Howell and his ex-girlfriend.
Right. So the ex-girlfriend is incredibly crucial because her testimony at trial ties Julius Jones to the gun and a robbery. And like basically she found the gun with the red bandana when she found it in the center console of his vehicle. And
Which was commissioned in previous crimes. Like hadn't
Yeah.
he given her jewelry from a previous armed robbery?
Yes. This is also another
Ah!
more devastating parts of her testimony. So
Right.
she asked him about the gun, and it's described as similar. Obviously, she can't know for a fact it's the same gun, but Jones had the idea that there's two of these silver guns in Jones's possession, or Jones and Jordan's possession, is kind of weird. So she ties him there, and it was rare too. It was like 25 caliber ammunition, which is apparently rare for a pistol. I didn't know that, but that's apparently what I'm told. And Jones admitted to having the gun in there with, like pantyhose that go over your head, a bandana, and like his robbery kit. So she also testified that he had given her jewelry, 4 gold chains specifically. He had showed her 4, but only given her 1. And the dates that she describes are after a jewelry store robbery where Jones, wearing the bandana with the same gun, robbed this jewelry store. But the pawn receipts also match up to what she says, because the 3 chains were pawned by Julius Jones with him literally showing his ID in his name the day, like right around the days after she was shown the chains. When he took back the gold chain he gave her, there's a pawn receipt for, again, like the next day or the following day after that, of him pawning 1 gold chain. So she ties him to a bunch of these robberies. And there's, by the way, Jones was pawning stereo equipment, all different. So there's crimes that we know he did that we just don't know who the victims are. Like but we know he wasn't pawning all this stuff for no reason.
He found it on the street. He found
Yeah.
all of the jewelry on the
Yeah.
street. Yeah, I think that this whole mentality that this is a guy that just got caught up in this racial web of the criminal
Yeah.
justice system through no fault of his own. It's so preposterous on its face. So let's talk a little bit about this. The people's perception of Julius Jones.
Wait,
I keep.
I forgot to mention the threatening letter. Like
Oh yeah.
I just realized that was the question. So her testimony was devastating. Obviously, she also
Right.
placed him in the area of the murder the night of the murder,
Mhm.
and she tied him to other carjackings too, which happened literally a week before and 6 days before the murder. One of which he's convicted of. So he sends her a letter while he's in prison, and it says, "Listen, you're gonna have to do something for me. Now I'm not threatening you,
He
but
said you're gonna have to do it for you, not
yeah."
for me.
And
Ugh.
he's like, "But I got some crazy ass relatives and you know how they are." He's like, "You have to say that you don't recall or you don't remember because you can't get in trouble for that." And what's funny about this is that the Jones defense team has been going with the strategy of saying this letter doesn't exist because in the transcript it's transcript as text. In the clemency hearing, they presented the physical letter written by Julius Jones after they claimed it didn't exist. And then Jones later on, because all these lawyers are not on the same page, they're all telling a bunch of different lies, admitted to sending the letter, but he said he sent this letter to comfort her.
What? We can read?
Yeah, like
That's
it's
incredible.
insane.
So what did he say in the letters? I believe he sent numerous letters to Megan, the sister
Yeah.
of Paul
Oh,
Howell.
Megan Toby. So he sent her letters that were like basically demanding that she change her testimony, sending pictures of Jordan and Jones, which, by the way, not a great idea because when she saw the pictures, she realized that the cornrows would have been bumpy on the skull cap, and she noticed that it was smooth.
Smooth. Yeah.
So yeah, definitely not not the best plan. But it's not just him sending letters because that is happening, but her address is out there partially because they try to film part of the documentary literally at her house. So the supporters are sending letters and they're sending a lot more threatening letters. Like there's a limit on what Jones could send from prison, but like his supporters are flooding them with different things about change your testimony, you racist scumbag, and all this stuff, which is crazy because again, they're saying it's the other black guy. And the
Yeah.
idea that Megan Toby wants a guilty black, she's so racist. She wants a guilty black man to be executed for a crime for killing her brother, even though she knows he didn't do it, it's preposterous.
Yeah. Why? Why would you finger somebody else in that case anyway? This poor woman, I mean, imagine having to go through everything that she has and then be threatened by the public to dissuade you from telling what you know is the truth that is supported by mounds, just
Yeah.
evidentiary support out the wazoo. I just can't imagine what this family is dealing with. And the thing that's most upsetting about all of this is that Paul Howell and his family have just been totally lost in this. No one seems to care. Everybody's talking about Julius Jones and what's going on with him. This man was murdered in cold blood, and Julius Jones tried to take out the whole family. He tried to kill a bunch of kids,
Yeah.
and nobody seems to give a shit about this, to give a shit about the family. The documentary film crew accosting her at her home is
Yeah.
very upsetting. But she's standing strong. She's done, I believe, like one maybe two interviews, and she's saying like,
There,
listen, this is what I said in testimony. I stand by what I said.
They're starting to do more interviews now. The family has set up like an Instagram Justice for Paul Howe, a Facebook Justice for Paul Howe, and a YouTube channel Justice for Paul Howe, and I believe they're on Twitter under the same name. But yeah, it's I talked about this about how they basically not only it's Julius Jones killed Paul Howe, but the Innocence Project tried to erase and eradicate his family because
Right.
they've smeared them, they've dismissed them, they've treated them like they're subhuman garbage. Like when you don't ask permission to reenact the most horrific moment of somebody's life in front of their house, like I can only imagine the horror of Megan Toby, who witnessed her brother murdered in a golden Suburban, seeing lights set up in front of her house and a golden Suburban pull up. And I've seen that reenactment. It looks like her. It looks like the kids. And they just decided to stage that to save a few extra bucks or whatever reason. Like I try to give everybody the minimum benefit of the doubt. Like Megan it probably inherited this home from her parents. Her parents were dead. So maybe they thought like, "Oh, well the parents died so they don't own the home anymore." They didn't realize she lived there.
But they
But
didn't do basic due diligence.
yeah,
They could have done that by just looking up property records.
true. And also, like, they were already writing letters to the Toby family at the time. Like, not a massive thing. The documentary obviously spurred that on even more. But yeah, it's the fact is they didn't care because it's not about that side. Like, it's not they're not interested in them, and that's just horrific.
And nobody's asking this question, but what could they possibly be getting out of this by saying that Julius Jones was the murderer when he was in fact not? How would it benefit them in any way? Nobody's asking that. Like, why on earth would they lie about this?
It's I don't, again, I don't know. It's like the documentary leads off with them claiming like Edmond, this area is racist,
Yeah, yeah.
which again, it's like an attack on, it's not only they're attacking the family, they're attacking the community. They're like, this black kid who doesn't live there came and killed a white person. Even in
Mhm.
their version, the other black kid came in and killed a white person in front of his kids.
But they're
So
all
they're,
so paranoid about,
yeah,
having the back of the hair stand on their neck with young black
yeah.
hoodlums coming in the
Well,
neighborhood. It's like that's what you're claiming happened
yeah,
anyway.
that's the thing is they're like, "Oh, this plays into old racial stereotypes about black people coming in from the inner city and ruining the suburbs and committing crimes." It's like it doesn't play into stereotypes. It's literally what happened
Mhm.
nobody disputes that this is what happened. And the Innocence Project has done this in other cases where they found like the closest white person to point the finger at. They just could not do that in this case.
Right.
So, like the idea that Edmund is on trial here, and they bring up, they're like, oh, in the 60s, after the Martin Luther King riots, white flight happened to Edmond. Like, that's not relevant. That's not interesting. That's not anything. Like, this was a close-knit neighborhood. The Howe family lived a lot in this neighborhood.
Mhm.
After Paul Howe was murdered and his father called the police, his brother, his older brother, because Paul Howe was a baby, came over to the house and saw his brother laying down dead in the driveway. Like, this was a close-knit community, and the idea that you would try to churn that and smear that, it's just it's horrible. And yeah, like the racial components of this is so absurd and ridiculous. I get that's why they're taking the case. Like if Julius Jones murdered another black person, we would not hear about it.
Right.
Oklahoma has 7 people on death row that are scheduled for execution. I think one of them has gotten a minor bit of attention, but the reason why this one has attention is because Julius Jones murdered a white person, and it was a businessman, and it was in front of his kids. Like that's the reason people should care about it, but it's because he's a black person who's facing the consequences of his own actions against a white person.
Right, right. And then there have been accusations levied at the prosecution for using racially charged language just merely by using the word prowl, which is common.
Yeah.
I don't really think that this is racially linked language. And the other thing that I read, I think it was on the Innocence Project website, was that one of the jurors said the N word and said that he should be
Right.
taken out and shot. So is that validated? Did anybody who
So,
heard this or who knew about this?
so the prosecution's two racialized things. One was announcing that they're pursuing the death penalty. That's considered racist.
That's it.
That's one of the two things. And then the second one is she said that Julius Jones was on the prowl that night. And she
He
argued
was
that
on the prowl that
yes.
night.
And then the third one that's like in and out is they say that they argued he was a continuous threat, which plays into anti-black stereotypes. But by Oklahoma law, to pursue the death penalty, you have to argue continuous threat to society. Now, as for the juror thing, this is something that was adjudicated at the time. This juror came up and said that somebody said they should take him out back and shoot him at the time. The racial epithet was never present at the time. It first appeared
Really?
in 2017.
That I think that is on the Innocence Project's
Yeah,
website.
and it's just not there. There's also like another pointless, a non-existent allegation of racism that I don't believe, and the reason it's pointless is because it has to do with the arresting officer. Allegedly the arresting officer told him to go ahead and run for it, N-word, and had his hand on his gun, which you're like, oh my god, if you're like in this camp, so racist. It's like, but that doesn't mean anything. Like if let's say the arresting officer was a racist, that doesn't mean that the DNA doesn't match
It
Julius
doesn't change
Jones.
the facts of the
Yeah,
case, right?
it's and
I
also
would argue that that's even true of the juror, although
yeah.
that seems like it's totally unsubstantiated. But none of this changes the alibi situation, the DNA evidence, or who he was as an individual. I want to talk a little bit about that. This claim that he only was convicted of petty crimes is absolutely false. He had 3 armed robbery guilty charges. I believe he pled guilty in those where he had pointed a gun
Yeah.
at somebody.
So
Um,
it's
these were not
actually
petty crimes.
it's actually weasel language because at the time of the trial, he was only convicted of these other crimes. By the way, some of them were like they caught him once holding a gun, a fake gun that was sprayed to look real with a mask and gloves near an ATM. Like they caught him in stolen cars and all this. But the idea that they go with is that technically he was convicted after the fact. So he, at
Oh,
the
come
time of
on.
trial, he wasn't convicted of any violent crimes, but he was committing violent crimes that week, one of which he pled guilty to. And he was trying to make the case that he pled guilty because his lawyer lied to him, but like he was caught dead to rights in that in a number of ways. One, they found the Mercedes that he stole at gunpoint, where he pointed a gun at his head, silver gun, red bandana, same MO, except he didn't shoot this person. They found that Mercedes at his apartment complex. A person who worked at his apartment complex spotted him in it. Another person reported the Mercedes there because he didn't think a Mercedes belonged in this apartment complex based on the cars that were typically in this area. When they arrested him, they found a forged registration document that spelled Mercedes with the Z. In in his guilty plea, he spelled Mercedes with a Z. So yeah.
God, what
So,
an idiot.
oh,
Oh my
it's
God.
even worse because he was arrested for this in 1999. Like, that's when the carjacking happened. He was convicted of this after the death penalty case in 2006. So Julius Jones had 7 years to learn how to spell Mercedes, and he didn't
Never
do it.
did. Never
Yeah,
could
no.
do it. It's probably why he failed out of school. I keep hearing this claim that, well, he was an upstanding
Yeah.
student and he was on scholarship and he played football or basketball or whatever. He failed out of Oklahoma University, Oklahoma
Yeah.
State. First
Oh,
semester,
you.
0.8 GPA.
Yes.
Great work
Well,
there, buddy.
it's
Never played on a team there.
yeah, it's crazy because like they'll show like pictures because people don't know. They'll show pictures of him, and in the reenactment, he's always wearing a basketball jersey because they mix it up whether he was a basketball player or a
Or
football
a football
player.
player. Yeah.
First of all, I would go with football because he's 5'9". Like, he's not playing serious college basketball at 5'9". That's
Yeah.
just not the case. But he played basketball in high school. I think they won state once, and this is like irrelevant information that they give us about how, like, look at him, he's a star. But he never played for an Oklahoma sports team, any of them at all. He got a scholarship out of high school, true, to Oklahoma University, wasn't going to class, point 0.8 GPA. I don't even know how that's possible to get a point 0.8 GPA. Like, if if your temperature is around 98 degrees, like, you should be able to at least get a 1 GPA, but he got a
Yeah.
point 0.8. He says he was in summer classes looking forward to his sophomore year, whatever. He was literally kicked out after his first semester. He lost his scholarship. He was not in school. And you see, like, James Corden talk about how he is a great student. The documentary portrays him as a great student and a student athlete. And I remember there's a podcast that I did, the Mile Higher podcast, where
Oh,
they talked about him walking onto the basketball team and just joining up. And it's like, he, even in the Viola Davis documentary, they say his plan was to try to walk on. But, like, the game of telephone, it's like, oh, he did walk on. He's like a
right.
basketball superstar. And it's like, no.
Yeah. They just man, their blindness in that podcast was egregious. I was watching that like, "Oh, I wanna just get in there." One of the things that they said that was so infuriating to me is that he was not allowed to testify on his own behalf.
Oh, dear God.
I'm like, "These people don't have just any constitutional understanding. You're always allowed to do that, you know?" And, something that you said in your video, Julius Jones has had 13 appeals. The Supreme Court has said that this case is solid 4
Yep.
times. And in
Yes.
testimony, he was like, "No, I don't wanna testify on my own behalf," because he knew that he was gonna sink his own case with his idiot lies. Yet these politically motivated organizations and individuals and podcasters are all hell-bent on categorizing this as this innocent man that's caught in a racist justice system through no fault of his own. And, they're saying that he's about to be murdered by the state, the
Yeah.
irony. Right. So if you could talk a little bit about that. Did they mention that in the documentary?
Yes. So in the
Ugh.
documentary, they say that Jones didn't even know he wasn't going to be able to testify in his own trial. As you pointed out, 13 courts reviewed this. This is such a basic constitutional like issue. I mean, we watched the Rittenhouse where something close to this about him not speaking to the police was brought up, and the judge's reaction to this because it would torch the case, which, by
Right.
the way, epic on the judge.
Epic,
Like,
right.
that's how basic this is. And the on the Jones family website, the Justice for Paul Howell website, they have a transcript, but it's only part of it, and it shows him refusing 2 times. In
Mhm.
my video, I pulled up this document, which shows him again. This is the transcript of the court testimony, his own words, refusing 4 times. In the pardon and parole hearing, they must have found another page. He refused it 5 times in this hearing, and he admitted that he refused it, but he changed his story to, "Oh, I didn't want to show emotion in front of the jury. Like I wanted to testify, but my lawyer, like basically he's an idiot and he didn't understand the judge's very direct, simple questions."
That's
And
irrelevant
yeah,
anyways. Is that any basis to say that his constitutional rights were violated? Being like,
well,
"I'm too stupid to
yeah,
understand."
it's actually not that's even not true. And he didn't like basically he didn't want to show in front of the jury because his lawyer advised him not to do that. But Oklahoma law actually considers this, and this is one of the benefits of Julius Jones's lawyers not only being liars, but being people who don't practice in the state of Oklahoma. They never have this hearing where they ask you if you want to testify in front of the jury. So there's a great moment in that clemency hearing where the one guy on the board who's asking Jones questions says, "Okay, you didn't want to show emotion in front of the jury." And he's like, "That is true." He's like, "The jury wasn't there." And Jones is like, "Oh." And then he says, "Oh, well, they were there." And he's like, "No, by law, they weren't there." And the guy makes fun of the lawyers later on for not knowing this because if they tried one case in the state of
Right,
Oklahoma,
then they would have
they
known,
would
right.
know this.
Mm.
And so Jones is a serial liar. And after it's said repeatedly that they weren't there, without acknowledging that he's dead wrong on something he's been saying this for a long time, he says, "I didn't want to show emotion in front of the judge." Like he just changes his story on the fly, and you can see it on video. It's amazing because he has no case, and it's like, yeah, Oklahoma. By the way, that's a very progressive, like very pro defendant kind of thing to have in one of the reddest states in the country.
Right.
But yeah, so it's total nonsense. He admitted that he said it that he was asked in the testimony. The documentary frames it like he was never even told. They just rested. Which, by the way, I do want to talk about the defense resting because that's another
Sure.
stupid talking point.
Yeah.
So what's presented is like and this all this relies on people having no legal knowledge. What's presented in the documentary is that after the prosecution put on their case, the defense is like the defense rests, and then they just put him to death. Basically, they gave him the death penalty. They didn't put on a defense. What the defense resting means is that they're not calling their own witnesses because they had no witnesses to call that weren't called by the prosecution. Can't call the family. It's been adjudicated on appeal that that was a good decision and their alibi was false because they would have called Brenda Cujo and she would have contradicted the alibi. Julius Jones wasn't going to testify, so they couldn't call him.
Right.
Everybody else that they were going to call was brought up by the prosecution. So the defense was conducted in cross examination. So they make it seem like they didn't defend Jones. It's not true. He cross-examined all of the witnesses. They just had the same list of witnesses. Like that was the issue. So like even that is really weaselly language that they didn't put on a defense. They actually put on a really good defense. And the lawyer for Jones is portrayed as this bumbling idiot. And they're like, he never tried a capital case, which is true. But he had tried at least a dozen murder trials. And all of their arguments for ineffective counsel are related to the murder trial portion of it, not related to the capital offense portion of it. And also, this guy's gone on to be a legendary lawyer. Even then, he had a really good record. People don't realize they think public defenders are idiots, but like nobody has the trial experience that public defenders
Right.
have. Like
Definitely. They
when
become public defenders so
yeah,
that they can get the trial experience.
and when these big lawyers, like, like Ben Crump and all these like woke lawyers that you see on TV, like actually take on a case, they don't know anything about the laws. They actually
Mhm.
contract out the public defender's office in order to defend their case. So
Right.
even the big lawyers are using public defenders because that's how good they are.
Oh, this is so preposterous. I wonder if Kim Kardashian knows any of this. Do you think that some of these celebrities truly believe in his innocence, or is this just a plea from the public to get these social points, to accrue kind of social justice points, where these white people are perceived by others as like fighting for the black cause? Is that the whole reason they're doing this?
I mean, I think if you only get one side of the story and you don't even acknowledge the other side, then it's easy to fall into those traps. The Kim Kardashian thing is really questionable because there's like a pattern, and Devin Tracy, Atheism is Unstoppable, has labeled this pattern like the illiterati because she takes on only cases. It appears like she's taking on only cases of black people that kill white people with alliterated names: Julius Jones, Crystal Kaiser, Kevin Cooper, Rodney Reed, Purvis Payne, Bernard. I forgot what his last name is, but it definitely has a B in the last name. And all these people are black people that kill white people that are 100% guilty. They even
Mhm.
get extra DNA testing and it proves them guilty, like in the Rodney Reed case and the Kevin Cooper case.
Ooh.
And but they all have alliterated names, and Kim Kardashian's like trying to get them out. But I watched an SNL thing where Kim Kardashian was talking about how she's following in her father's footsteps of getting innocent black people off from prison, and she references OJ Simpson because
No.
yeah, exactly. And they start joking about how like this is like, she stabbed, like she makes like stabbing jokes related to OJ. So I'm like, maybe she does know. And there's a very creepy thing with the Rodney Reed case where she poses in a shirt that Rodney Reed wore. And I don't have this image up, but I like, and you're not on Twitter, so you might not have seen it. And people realized that she was posing the exact way that they found Stacey Stites in that case. They found her body.
Oh my gosh. I should have you back on to talk about Rodney Reed. That is a
Yes.
oh my gosh, that's a whole nother thing.
So
Um,
I think she might know, or she might be that dumb that she's like, alliteration, it's a sign, because these Hollywood types are into astrology and
right.
all this hoodoo, voodoo, new agey like crap.
But that is so asinine, just knowing that the victims are gonna be exposed to your series of lies, but you're just doing it so that people think that you are a champion of the Black community. That's such, like, a uniquely shitty
Yeah.
thing to do to somebody and to do to somebody's family. When somebody in their family, a loved one, has been murdered right in front of them,
Yeah.
I do they have any guilt about this? Do they have any shame? Clearly not. It's just infuriating.
Well,
Um,
that's why they never like it is very rare for them to even mention the Howe family or
mhm,
the Paul Howe by name. Like James Corden's entire 2 segments never mention Paul Howe by name. This is what I talk about where they're like not only erasing the victim but the family. Like
right.
they don't ask to have them on, they don't mention them by name. And it's really sick because you watch the Pardon and Parole Board hearing, like the Facebook video, and you can see in the live chat people are attacking the Howe family. Like it's crazy.
It's just terrible and disgusting. I hope these people, can realize what they're doing to this family. And in the quest for justice, what a miscarriage of justice this is. We're always talking about, especially in the true crime community, people that are incarcerated through no fault of their own, like legitimate miscarriages of justice in that way. But this is a miscarriage of justice for the victim's family and the victim. And it just drives me crazy that nobody's talking about this.
Yeah.
Before we wrapped up, I did want to talk a little bit about the parole board. Am I understanding correctly that the parole board is kind of staffed with some
Yes.
activists, with some Black Lives Matter activists?
There's 3 activists, but before I get into that, I do wanna talk about, because you mentioned the true crime. I think that part of this is the evolution, like, the natural evolution of true crime becoming so popular.
Right. Right.
And it's almost like adapting a movie into a video game because, like, true crime, you're normally you're listening, you're watching, the case is old, and, like, there's nothing you can do about the case, so you're,
Right.
like, a passive listener. But these are, like, you get to be actively engaged more like a video game, and before people in the chat say that I don't play video games, so I'm not qualified for this. Like, relax. So like now you get to do justice and all this different stuff. You get to participate in solving this crime. So you've created content that's like personally engaging to people. And like if the guy's actually innocent, that's great. But in these cases where they're 100% guilty and clearly the whole case that they're making like depends on lying and trying to win over the public opinion because there's no way they could win in court. 13 appeals have shown us that. It's really toxic and cancerous, and like that's what we're watching, like
It is a
unfold.
choose your own adventure ending,
Yeah.
isn't it? And maybe that's why there's so much public support for him, because people will just want to get involved. Um, so yeah, let's talk about the parole board. I don't know anything about these people. If you could give us a little rundown.
So the in the state of Oklahoma, they have this pardon and parole board, and I think they're like a new, relatively new kind of thing, or they have new parameters. And there's 3 of the 4 people who have voted in both hearings to let Jones out are in the tank for Julius Jones. And I mean like Adam Luck, who we talked about like off air, is basically he has a TED talk and you can look it up. And he says Oklahoma's prison system, like incarcerating guilty black people, is like literal slavery. And like, who's in favor of slavery? Not me, not you. Like, obviously, we would be against slavery. So he's overwhelmingly on the side of these defendants getting out of prison. He also has a thing, like a little side hustle, where they hire people from prison and they get tax credits from the government when they're released.
Oh
So,
no,
like,
what a terrible conflict of interest.
yes, 100%. And there's a female that's on there that has a similar conflict of interest. Like she works with that same like company or like nonprofit.
Oh.
On the third guy who did recuse himself in the 11th hour, he's literally retweeting justice for Julius Jones stuff. He's literally retweeting Kim Kardashian stuff on other cases. He's clearly in the tank for that side. And he did recuse himself, but they just replaced him for the hearing with another guy that hates the death penalty. In fact, in the hearing, he literally, like, even though Jones was claiming innocence, he was like, I don't think the death penalty is appropriate for a 19-year-old. And then the fourth guy, who's the cool guy, is a former prosecutor. He's the one who cross-examined Julius Jones and caught him in 5 lies in 10 minutes. Like, that guy is the one who's been consistent. Like, Jones doesn't qualify for these hearings because he's been violent in prison. He's a known gang member in prison. He has multiple different, like, they call them X level violations, which are the highest violations in prison. He's like, no hearing, no clemency vote, no commutation vote, absolutely not. And when given the opportunity to question Jones, he shredded his credibility.
Mhm.
But like, none of that matters. I remember in one part of the hearing, they had this guy explain like how he's against the death penalty and why he voted for clemency. And then they shift over to the guy who's going to vote against him. And he starts explaining like they caught him in multiple different lies and how can you vote this way? And Adam Luck, the prison equals slavery guy, instead of addressing any of his points, just says, "Oh, we don't have to there's actually no requirement to explain it. Like, basically, shut up. Like, stop explaining your side because that's like damaging." And what's really gross, and I pointed this out in the video, is that the case after the DNA matched Jones is really down to Megan Toby's description. Megan Toby showed up to the pardon and parole board hearing, the first one, and to the clemency hearing. She testified. After you testified, there's time for questions. They never once asked Megan Toby a single question. The whole case for innocence relies on this, and they didn't even bother to ask her anything related to the description because they didn't want that out there in the public eye because the fix is in.
Oh my gosh, that is outrageous. That's outrageous. I can't believe that they can do this. Pardon my ignorance, but I was a little confused by this. Why is he up for commutation from death sentence to life with parole? Am I right about this?
Yeah.
Instead of without parole?
So, in this case, the pardon parole board doesn't have actual power. They have the power to recommend, and they're recommending life with parole because they want to let him out. Like,
Yeah.
Julius Jones has money to make. Like, I don't know if you're aware of this, but he's designing sneakers while he's in prison. He's
Ugh.
he's working on his book. He's doing all these different things to profit off of murdering Paul Howe in front of his children. Like, that's how sick this is. And those sneakers are going to come out, by the way. They're ugly as hell. They're like all orange with the white like Julius like Jones text on them. But that's what he's doing right now. And like there should be laws against profiting off of the crimes that you
Right.
commit. But like he's planning to profit in the future and he's profiting now. They're sending him so much money while he's in prison that he's been able to give his family $18,000 while he was in prison. And remember what I said earlier about how they were going to carjack Paul Howe for something that had a $4,000 street value.
Right.
He was going to split that with Jones. So this guy, with Jordan. So this guy was going for $2,000, and now he has enough money that he can give $18,000 to his family. He's also transferred money to other prisoners. The other prisoners that all of a sudden came forward with jailhouse confessions are also being flooded with money. And this is despite the fact that they have horrible criminal records. Like, one of the people that are on Julius Jones's side is somebody who was convicted of killing a baby. And the way that they killed the baby was by pouring scalding hot water on the baby's genitals.
Oh
Like,
my god.
this is one of the people that they're like, oh, they should have brought him up on the stand to testify. Like, that's like the level. And there's another one that's another murderer. And the new one is like a pathological liar that, like, at one point he was convicted of a disability fraud because he shot himself and said he got injured on the job. So like, they're all
Ugh.
pathological liars, and these people are profiting off of this. People out there in the world, in the name of justice, are sending them money, and that's sick.
This is so immoral and disgusting, and I think you said gross
Yeah.
earlier. Yeah, this is totally gross. So what do you think is going to happen before the 18th? Do you have faith that the governor is going to stand strong on this? Do you think he's gonna commute the sentence?
So we have mixed presence from the governor because he is the Oklahoma governor that has commuted more sentences than any other governor in the history of Oklahoma. And the Pardon and Parole Board has fed him a bunch of these commutations. And this was done while Trump was trying to pass that First Step Act. So like, it's like, oh, we're like criminal justice reform Republicans. However, two people that he's commuted on recommendation have been incredibly violent. There was one, his name is Lawrence something, and I forgot, but you can look this up. He was literally a cannibal. He killed a woman, cut out her heart, then tried to feed it to members of a family. I believe they were actually related to him. And he attempted to murder 3 of those people after feeding them this human heart. And one of them escaped. And this was like 6 weeks after he was let out. So this guy, like total monster, they let him out. Same age as Julius Jones, by the way. So like crazy reoffender. And ever since then, the governor's been a little bit more hesitant, as he should, to accept these recommendations. But the governor also, on top of that, has reinstated the death penalty. Like they suspended it back in 2016, 2017. And Governor Kevin Stitt fought in federal court to get the death penalty re-implemented. So it's like a mix on those 2 factors on where he's at. So it's really down to the public pressure, which is why I've been telling people, contact Governor Stitt, call them, write them letters, do whatever you can to make sure that we don't see him commute Jones's sentence. Because make no mistake, if Jones gets commuted even to life without parole, he's going to be up for these pardon and parole hearings every 6 months for the rest of his life. He will get out eventually.
Even if he has life without parole?
Without parole, yeah. He wasn't even eligible for one of these hearings, the first one, under the death penalty, which is why the governor said you have to do it the proper way. But yeah, they'll bring him up. They will break the rules to have him there. And the Howe family will have to be dragged into these hearings time after time to give their testimony. And remember, Megan Toby is the only adult witness of the murder. She testified at trial. She's 20 years older than Julius Jones. Like, she's already getting up there. She's in around her late 50s, 60s. She's not going to be around forever. And it's going to be way easier to get Jones out of prison once she eventually passes away.
Right.
So, like, he will get out in the future. He will profit off of this case going forward. And I don't think as a nation we can let like far left activists go into the reddest state or one of the reddest states in the country, turn a murderer into a hero, and make this a profitable venture. So yeah, absolutely. Like, it's literally death penalty or he's getting out, if not now, eventually. And if he gets life without parole, they'll immediately recommend him for time served, because life is just 25 years.
Right.
He's been in there for almost 20. You only have to serve 85% of your sentence.
Yep. Exactly. So you mentioned a little bit about contacting the governor. What can we do, especially if we do not have Twitter or Facebook? I've dropped most of your links in the description, but if you could tell the audience what they can do to put public pressure on the governor to not commute the sentence.
Well, there's a contact form, and I think you would have linked it in the description if you grabbed the links from my recent videos, like a contact form for the governor where you can contact him. And there's a phone number that was in my most recent video that I think I left in the description. I don't know it off like the top of my head, but you can actually call and leave messages. You could also go to the Justice for Paul Howe Instagram, the Justice for Paul Howe Facebook page if you don't have Twitter. And they're posting the phone numbers and all the information on where to call. They're also gathering like media. So like this will likely be on there, like eventually, like clips from it or whatever. Like they're gathering media and linking to that so it can all be centralized in one location. Follow me. I'm going over this case. I'm assuming you're going to be on this case from now on. So I would subscribe to your channel.
Yeah, I am obsessed with this case now. I just can't believe that I just heard about this. And you know what led me to this case was investigating Rodney Reed.
Yeah.
And that's how I got into this. So that was my guest, actual justice warrior. Thank you so much for covering this case. You really are doing great work. And I just want the audience to remember Paul Howe's family and what they're going through and how tremendously stressful this must be for them, what they're up against. And please do read the links in the description and contact the governor. And I wish you well. And I'll be watching your channel for the next week to see what happens.
Yeah. All right.
Thanks
Thank
so
you
much
for having me on.
Bye, guys.